She was just the janitor, until the translator vanished and a billionaire CEO had no one left to save his billion-dollar deal, except her. Blake Harrison stared at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the city breathe beneath him. Endless traffic, endless motion. The skyline looked as calm and immovable as always, but inside, his nerves were on fire. He adjusted the cuff of his light gray Armani suit, though it didn't need adjusting. Everything was supposed to be perfect today. Every moment leading up to this one had been part of a meticulous plan crafted over 6 months. The German investors were already in the building, sharp, punctual, methodical. Their arrival was like the ticking of a clock, precise and inevitable. This was it. The deal that would define Varian's future. The one that would expand the company from a national success to a global force. He turned as his assistant Jeremy walked in, pale, slightly breathless, with the look of someone trying to soften bad news before delivering it. Blake didn't even need to hear the words to know something had gone wrong. "Blake," Jeremy said cautiously, "I just got off the phone with Marcus, the interpreter. He's stuck at Frankfurt Airport. Apparently he caught some kind of virus. He's running a fever. They wouldn't even let him board." Blake blinked, then exhaled hard through his nose, rubbing the bridge of it between 2 fingers. "You're joking." "I wish I was. He says he tried to find a backup, but it's too last minute. There's no one available who speaks technical German and understands investment lingo at this level." Of all the variables they had accounted for, tech readiness, pitch decks, cultural nuances, even catered German snacks, this one wasn't supposed to be a problem. Blake had worked with Marcus before. He was flawless, professional and absolutely essential. Without a translator, the entire presentation risked falling apart. The Germans were fluent in English, yes, but not when it came to the dense, high-stakes language of mergers, equity holdings, patent jurisdictions, and long-term revenue strategies. Any misunderstanding could blow the whole thing up. Blake walked over to the table and picked up the pitch deck folder, the weight of it suddenly feeling hollow in his hands. He looked through the glass wall of the boardroom. There they were. 5 impeccably dressed executives from Berlin, sipping water, glancing at their watches. They had flown across the Atlantic for this. If Varian came across as unprepared, careless or worse, amateurish, they'd pull out. These weren't the types to give second chances. Jeremy hovered silently, clearly waiting for instruction, for magic, for some miracle. Blake's mind was already spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, trying to calculate damage control. Should they delay the meeting? Reschedule? Pretend nothing's wrong and wing it with slides? No. That would be suicidal. He reached for his phone, flipping through contacts, but every possible solution ended in the same problem. No one with the right skills was available now, and they had only 10 minutes left. The silence of the office pressed in like heavy air. Blake was a man used to pressure. He'd survived hostile board takeovers, brutal pivots, near bankruptcy. But this was personal. He had built Varian from a borrowed desk in a shared co-working space to a 300-person powerhouse. He didn't just need this deal, he believed in it. The German team could open distribution in half of Europe, and a pipeline to investors across the EU. Missing this opportunity wouldn't just hurt the company. It would crush the momentum, shake the board's confidence, and send a message to competitors that Varian wasn't ready to play on the world stage. He paced to the window again, jaw clenched, eyes darting across the streets below. From 37 floors up, everything looked small, manageable, but down here, time was running out fast. The scent of lemon-scented disinfectant mixed faintly with old carpet as Sarah Miller leaned over, scrubbing the tile near the executive restroom with rhythmic, practiced movements. Her arms ached from the morning shift at the hospital offices, and her lower back throbbed slightly after hours of bending, reaching, lifting. She had told herself she wouldn't pick up this extra shift, not today. But when her phone lit up that morning with a last-minute request to cover for a sick co-worker at the corporate tower, she couldn't say no. The rent was due in 4 days, Lily's prescription needed refilling, and the number in her checking account had already turned red. She wrung out the mop with a hard twist, water dripping back into the gray bucket beside her. Her hands were covered with yellow gloves, a little too big, worn out around the fingertips. A few feet away her daughter Lily sat cross-legged against the wall, reading a well-worn copy of Heidi in English, with the German translation scribbled between the lines. Lily didn't complain about spending her summer days following her mother to cleaning jobs, didn't whine about not going to the pool like other kids. She just followed, quietly. Always with a book. Always watching. Sarah glanced over and smiled faintly, a tired but loving expression. "Are you hungry, baby?" she asked, pausing for a breath. Lily shook her head. "I'm okay, but..." She tilted her head toward the hallway just beyond the door. "There are a bunch of serious-looking men in that glass room, and your boss looks kind of stressed." Sarah chuckled softly, shaking her head. "That's not my boss, that's someone 10 floors above the kind of people who even know my name." Lily didn't respond right away. She just stared down the hall toward the glass boardroom, where the tall man in the gray suit stood with his back to the window. The man's body language radiated tension, even from far away. After a pause, Lily said, "Mommy, your boss needs your help." Sarah stopped mid-wipe, turning her head slowly. "What?" Lily didn't blink. "That man, he needs help. I heard someone say the translator didn't show up, and you know German." Sarah straightened up, one hand on her lower back, one still gripping the mop. Her mouth opened slightly in surprise, then turned into a soft laugh. "Sweetheart, I mop floors, I don't crash corporate meetings and offer linguistic services to CEOs." "But you can," Lily said, her voice so calm and certain it unsettled Sarah more than any sarcasm could have. "You used to do stuff like that, you told me." Sarah swallowed. That was a long time ago. Before Lily was born, before her husband's car spun out on black ice coming back from a night shift, before the scholarships disappeared under a mountain of medical bills. Before Sarah had to choose between her degree and diapers. She had been fluent in German, still was, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in years, except to entertain Lily with bedtime stories or recite tongue twisters they'd giggle over while folding laundry. Once she had dreamed of working in embassies, translating at summits, helping shape the world from behind the scenes. Now she cleaned glass walls, others made decisions behind. Sarah turned back to her mop. "It's impossible, honey," she said softly. Not quite to Lily, not quite to herself. But Lily, still watching the boardroom through the narrow space between two pillars, just repeated it. "He needs your help." And somewhere inside Sarah, beneath the exhaustion, the resignation, the tightly packed memories, something stirred. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the echo of the woman she used to be. Sarah didn't speak for a long moment after Lily's quiet insistence. She stood there, one hand still on the mop, the other on her hip, staring down at the floor she'd just cleaned, so thoroughly it shimmered under the overhead lights. Her reflection looked back at her. Tired eyes. A thin line where a smile used to live. Strands of brown hair escaping from the bun under her faded blue cleaning cap. She was 32 years old and felt about 50 most days. Her back hurt, her knees cracked when she bent, but the thing that weighed most heavily on her was invisible. What she had lost. And what she had never let herself reclaim. She walked back to the janitor's closet and began rinsing out her bucket, slowly, mechanically. Her mind wasn't in her hands anymore. It had traveled backward, unbidden, to a time that now felt like another life. A university campus, vibrant and full of ambition, her textbooks stacked with sticky notes in both English and German, late-night debates about EU policy, long conversations with her husband Ben about where they would live after graduation, maybe Munich, maybe Berlin. He had supported her dreams with the kind of quiet certainty she didn't question, until it was gone. Her degree had been within reach. Honors in international relations, offers to intern with foreign consulates, a German language award. She had been known on campus as Sarah the diplomat, because of her effortless fluency and the way she could command a room without raising her voice. That was before the accident. Before the night Ben didn't come home, before the phone call from the state police and the hospital chaplain waiting at the emergency room. After that she couldn't even finish the semester. There were no government internships when you had a 6-month-old to feed, no world travel when you were applying for WIC and food stamps. Sarah had taken the first job she could get that offered health insurance, a night shift janitorial position at a warehouse distribution center. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what she had studied for, but it paid enough to survive. And then she just kept going, from warehouse to office, from part-time to double shifts. The German language books gathered dust on a shelf. The dreams became soft memories, then background noise, and eventually silence. And yet, she had never really lost the language. She still spoke it to herself sometimes, on lonely nights. She read bedtime stories to Lily in German, stories like Heidi, Max und Moritz, even fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. It became a quiet bridge between who she had been and who she had to be. It was the one thing she hadn't sacrificed completely. Now, in this shiny tower where everything smelled like coffee and polished glass, that old part of her, the part she had buried so deep, was stirring again. It made her uneasy. The thought of stepping into that boardroom, of putting herself forward, of being seen not as the janitor, not as the single mother who came in early and left late, but as someone with value beyond a mop and gloves, it scared her. She had trained herself to stay invisible. It had become a kind of protection, but Lily had seen something else. Lily had heard the tension in the air, had noticed the nervous energy, had read the moment better than most adults probably could. Somewhere in the hallway outside, the elevator dinged and a new group of office workers passed by, laughing about something one of them had said. Sarah listened as their voices echoed down the corridor. None of them knew her name. None of them had ever looked her in the eye, unless she was in their way. She took a slow breath and looked back at Lily, who was still watching her with that unsettling, calm wisdom she'd always had, far too much for someone her age. Her daughter didn't see her as a failure. She saw her as someone who could still be powerful. That realization hit Sarah with a quiet force. Then came the voice, not Lily's, a man's. Panicked, rushed, from the hallway near the executive break room. He was reading in German to her kid, I swear, like fluently, just now, in the lounge. Sarah froze, her heart stuttering. Another voice responded, hushed but firm. Get Blake, now. She had seconds, maybe less. A choice was barreling toward her. She could deny it, stay small, say she had no idea what they were talking about. She could go back to her mop, and pretend she never heard a word. She could keep cleaning until her hands cracked, and Lily went off to school never knowing what her mother once dreamed of becoming. Or she could lift her chin, look whoever came through that door in the eye, and let the voice she hadn't used in years finally be heard again. Her palms were sweating inside the gloves, her heart pounded against her ribs like it was trying to break out. She didn't feel ready. She didn't feel worthy. But sometimes life doesn't wait for permission. And footsteps were already coming her way. Blake came down the hallway like a storm bottled into a man. His jaw was clenched, shoulders tense, and his perfectly tailored suit moved with the sharp precision of someone used to cutting through chaos with control. But this was not a moment for control. This was desperation. He scanned the corridor quickly, his eyes locking onto Jeremy, who pointed, subtly, as if unsure this wasn't some mistake, toward the janitor closet at the far end of the hall. She's in there, Jeremy muttered, with her kid. She was reading German, I swear, like, really reading. Blake didn't respond. He didn't have time to process the strangeness of the situation, or the absurdity of the fact that his potential solution to $1 billion problem might be holding a mop and wearing a cleaning apron. He walked to the door and stopped just outside, took a breath, and knocked lightly. Inside, Sarah had just taken off her gloves. Her hands were shaking not from fear exactly but from adrenaline. The rush that came when everything around you stopped making sense, when the impossible suddenly knocked and asked for 5 minutes of your time. She opened the door before Blake could knock a second time. The man standing there looked taller in person. Up close, Blake's green eyes were sharp and direct, the kind that missed nothing and expected everything. But in that moment, behind the businessman's mask, Sarah saw something else: uncertainty, a rare and deeply human edge. It made her feel less invisible and somehow even more nervous. You speak German? Blake asked. He wasn't impolite, but he was urgent, straight to the point. Yes, Sarah replied, voice low but steady. Blake hesitated, his eyes searched her face, trying to gauge whether he was looking at a miracle or a misunderstanding. Fluently? Sarah nodded. I studied international relations, graduated top of my class. I lived in Dresden for a year. I've translated before, just not recently. His eyebrows lifted, clearly absorbing more than he expected. And you're working here as a cleaner, she said without flinching. Because life happens. But yes, I can translate, if that's what you're asking. Blake didn't speak for a moment. Then quickly he turned, slightly gesturing down the hall. The meeting starts in 4 minutes. The German team is expecting an interpreter. We have no backup. If we cancel, we lose the deal. You think you can do it? Sarah's stomach twisted. Her head said no. Her gut screamed this was madness, but something in her chest, something long dormant and defiant, straightened her spine. I can do it, she said. Not a whisper, not a boast, just fact. Blake nodded once. Follow me. She turned to Lily. Her daughter stood near the mop bucket, clutching the book tightly to her chest, her eyes wide but glowing. Sarah knelt briefly, touched her cheek. I'll be back soon, she said softly. Lily smiled. I know. Then Sarah stood up and walked beside the CEO, her footsteps surprisingly steady. They entered the executive wing, the polished floors gleaming like glass beneath them. The office workers along the way paused mid-conversation to watch the janitor walking alongside the boss, wearing a faded blue apron, a white t-shirt, jeans, and the posture of someone who no longer cared if she looked out of place. At the entrance to the boardroom, Blake stopped. There's no time for a full brief, he said. Just follow the structure of the deck. I'll lead the pitch, you translate. If they interrupt, go with them, then come back to me. I'll adjust on the fly. Think you're up for that? I told you I am, Sarah replied. He gave a slight nod, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was quiet and heavy with tension. 5 German executives sat at the far end of the long table, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a gray-haired man with rimless glasses, glanced at his watch, then looked up sharply when he saw Sarah walk in behind Blake. She felt the heat of their stares immediately. She felt the weight of judgment, of confusion, of that inevitable moment when they'd all realize she wasn't in a suit, wasn't the professional interpreter they were expecting. But she didn't look away. She took the seat beside Blake and waited, hands folded on the table, as he began. Gentlemen, Blake started, and Sarah listened, heart pounding. She translated his words into German with calm precision, her accent soft but authentic, her voice steady. The man with the glasses narrowed his eyes at her, clearly skeptical, but intrigued. As the minutes passed, Blake laid out his vision, his projections, the product roadmap. Sarah kept pace with him word for word, sentence for sentence, never stumbling, never hesitating. When one of the German executives raised a question in rapid-fire German, she answered smoothly, matching his tone, translating his point for Blake, and then delivering the reply with clarity and confidence. By the time the presentation reached its midpoint, the men who had entered the room with guarded expressions were now leaning forward, listening, occasionally nodding. The room was no longer quiet with tension, it was alive with discussion. Sarah had become the bridge between worlds, and she was holding it strong. No one mentioned the apron, no one asked why a janitor was speaking flawless German and defending international market strategy. Because in that moment, she wasn't a janitor. She was the missing piece to the puzzle, the one no one saw coming. As the meeting continued, the mood in the room began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. What had started as a tense, potentially disastrous encounter was evolving into something far more dynamic. Sarah could feel it happening, like the slow turn of a tide. At first she had to force herself to focus on every syllable, to suppress the tremor in her voice and the thundering of her heartbeat. But the more she spoke, the more the German language came back to her. Not just the vocabulary but the rhythm, the nuance, the culture embedded in it. It was like slipping back into a skin she hadn't worn in years, one she thought she'd outgrown but that still fit perfectly. She translated Blake's presentation word for word but not robotically. She adjusted tone, inflection, even vocabulary depending on who was speaking and what they needed to hear. She mirrored the pace of the investors, matched their cadence, and at one point even added a quiet joke about supply chain delays that made the gray-haired man with glasses smirk into his coffee. Blake, to his credit, didn't interrupt her once. He didn't correct or talk over her. He simply trusted her to hold the line, to be the voice he needed in a language he didn't speak, and she did. By the time Blake reached the key section of the pitch, the 5-year expansion plan for the European market, Sarah was no longer just translating. She was actively interpreting, clarifying complex ideas, adding cultural context, even refining phrases to better suit the business customs of the Germans. When one executive challenged a pricing model, Sarah replied first in German, before translating her own words back into English for Blake, saving precious seconds and turning what could have been a confrontation into a fluid exchange of ideas. Blake gave her a quick glance, then just a flicker of his eyes, but Sarah caught it. It wasn't doubt. It was recognition. The moment that would become legend in the office came near the end of the meeting. One of the younger German investors, skeptical from the start, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He asked, in perfectly clear but sharp German, "Why should we trust this startup over our more established competitors who already operate in Munich and Hamburg and have decades of brand equity?" Sarah didn't look to Blake. She turned to the man, met his gaze, and answered in German with such composure and quiet confidence that the whole room stilled. "Because your competitors are already paying twice as much to chase the same market, and they're slower. Varian's model isn't based on chasing trends. It's built for where the market will be, not where it's been. Trusting them is safe. But safe doesn't create growth, it protects what you already have." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. Blake looked at Sarah again. Longer this time, as if seeing her not as an anomaly or lucky coincidence, but as a force entirely on her own. The final few minutes passed quickly. The meeting concluded with polite goodbyes and a few unexpectedly warm handshakes. The German team exited calmly, their expressions more open than when they had arrived. A few even nodded to Sarah directly, offering quiet but meaningful acknowledgments as they left the boardroom. Once the door shut behind them, the silence that followed was almost surreal. Sarah exhaled slowly, as though releasing everything she had been holding in. Doubt, fear, grief. The weight of years spent believing her talents were buried too deep to be recovered. She hadn't realized until that moment just how much she had missed this feeling. Not pride exactly, but presence. Relevance. Being useful in a way that no one else in the room could replicate. Blake leaned back in his chair and let out a low breath. Then he turned to her, not smiling exactly, but with something softer in his expression than she'd expected. "You just saved the deal," he said simply. Sarah looked down at her lap, where her hands were folded tightly together, then back up at him. "I didn't know I could still do that," she replied. Blake gave a small shake of his head. "You never stopped knowing, you just stopped getting asked." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She stood slowly, her body still catching up to her mind. She picked up the faded blue apron she had folded over the back of the chair and held it in both hands, as though trying to reconcile the woman who wore it with the one who had just spoken on behalf of a tech company to a room full of European executives. As she turned to leave, Blake spoke again, this time with more weight in his voice. "Wait. I think we need to talk. Not now necessarily, but soon. Don't disappear." Sarah paused in the doorway, looked over her shoulder and nodded once. "I'll be around," she said. She walked out into the hallway where the building suddenly felt too bright, too clean, too sharp against her skin. Her knees felt unsteady, her head light. But her chest, her breath, her sense of self, those had never felt stronger. And just around the corner Lily stood waiting. The moment Sarah appeared, Lily ran up to her and threw her arms around her waist. "You did it, Mommy," she whispered into her shirt. "I knew you could." Sarah pulled her close, pressed her face into her daughter's hair, and held her there for a long time. She didn't have the words for what had just happened, but she knew, deep down, that something had shifted, not just in that boardroom but inside her. Something was waking up. Something she wasn't ready to let go of again. The next morning the office buzzed like a beehive shaken awake. Word had spread. Not in a formal announcement. Not from Blake, and certainly not from Sarah herself. But stories like that didn't stay quiet. Someone had seen her walk into the boardroom, someone else had overheard part of the meeting. A few had seen her afterward, still wearing her janitor's apron but with the posture of someone who had just stepped out of another life. And then someone had posted a blurry photo on the company's internal message board, a wide shot through the boardroom glass, with Sarah seated beside the CEO, speaking, translating, gesturing. A caption followed a few minutes later. "Is this the janitor?" It went viral within the company in under an hour. Sarah arrived at the building for her evening shift the same way she always did, on the bus, with Lily beside her, earbuds in, listening to an audiobook. But the moment they stepped into the lobby, something felt different. People looked up, not with the usual vague glance of office workers ignoring the cleaning crew, but with something closer to curiosity. Or recognition. Some even nodded politely. One man from IT held the elevator door for her and said, "Nice job yesterday," as if they were colleagues and had always been on equal footing. Sarah didn't quite know what to do with that. She smiled faintly, thanked him, and held Lily's hand a little tighter. That afternoon during her break, she received a call on her old cracked smartphone from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, thinking it was a bill collector, but when she heard the voice on the other end, her entire body went still. "Ms. Miller, this is Natalie from the Herald Business Journal. We're writing a piece about unexpected stories in corporate America, and someone here tipped us off about what happened at Virion yesterday. Would you be willing to talk to us about it, even anonymously?" Sarah blinked, unsure whether to laugh or hang up. "You're calling about me?" "Yes," the woman replied kindly. "It's a remarkable story." Sarah ended the call politely but declined. She didn't want attention. She wasn't doing this for interviews or headlines. She was just trying to survive, to raise her daughter, to keep a roof over their heads. She didn't need strangers deciding who she was, now that she'd had 5 minutes in the spotlight. But avoiding attention didn't stop the past from finding her. By the end of the week, 3 more messages had arrived. One from an old professor at her university, another from a nonprofit she'd once interned with, and the hardest of all, an email from her late husband's mother. The subject line was simple: "I saw you." And in the message, "You always had it in you. I wish Ben could have seen that moment." Sarah sat on the edge of her bed that night and stared at the message until her eyes blurred. She hadn't spoken to Ben's family in over 5 years, not since the arguments about custody, financial support, and what her future was supposed to look like. Back then, she had chosen silence, chosen distance. It hurt too much to have people remind her of the future that had died along with her husband. Now those ghosts were knocking again, not to accuse, but to acknowledge, and she didn't know how to feel about that. Even more complicated was Blake. He hadn't contacted her right away after the meeting, but that wasn't surprising. CEOs didn't follow up with janitorial staff, even if they'd saved a high-stakes international deal. But on Friday morning, when Sarah arrived to clock in for the early cleaning shift in the executive wing, she found a sealed envelope waiting for her in the staff locker room. Her name was written on the front in blue ink, her full name, in handwriting that was careful but confident. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. "Sarah, you don't belong in the shadows. What you did was extraordinary, but more than that, it was necessary, and I think it's time we had a real conversation about where you fit in this company. I know you're more than the role you've been playing. Let's talk. Monday, my office, 9 a.m. Blake Harrison." She read it twice, then a third time. For the first time in years, she felt something other than survival stir in her chest. Not hope, not quite, but maybe permission. She carried the note with her all weekend. Not as proof, not to show anyone, but to remind herself that it had happened. That someone who had the power to choose had chosen her. And he hadn't offered a favor, he had offered an opportunity. On Sunday night, Lily found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the darkened window, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "You're nervous," Lily said quietly, sitting across from her. Sarah smiled gently. "Yeah, I guess I am. Are you gonna go?" There was a pause, long and heavy. "I think so," Sarah whispered. Lily reached across the table and took her hand. "You should. They finally saw you, Mom. Not just what you do, who you are." And just like that, Sarah realized something she hadn't wanted to admit all week. She wasn't afraid of failing, she was afraid of being seen. Truly seen, and then being forgotten again. But her daughter saw her. Always had. Maybe it was time the rest of the world did too. Monday morning arrived with a soft gray sky and the kind of quiet that made everything feel heavier. Sarah woke up before the alarm, even before the sun had fully risen. She lay still in bed for a few minutes, watching the ceiling, listening to Lily's slow, steady breathing from the mattress beside hers. They shared the small bedroom in the one-bedroom apartment they rented just outside the city, where the walls were thin and the radiator clicked in the early hours like an old clock trying to keep time. The place was modest and worn, but it had been home for years. And this morning, for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she might be about to step out of it. Not just physically but emotionally. She felt like something was shifting, like a part of her life was quietly preparing to close, and another one was standing just on the edge of beginning. She moved gently so as not to wake Lily, stepping into the kitchen where she boiled water for tea, and stared blankly at the window above the sink. The glass was fogged, and outside the streetlights still glowed dimly. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the water, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of everything that was about to happen. She hadn't told anyone at work she was going to the meeting. She hadn't even told Lily the full truth. She just said she had an important talk and that she might be a little late coming back. At 7:45, she got dressed. Not in her cleaning uniform, but in a simple, dark blue blouse and slacks she'd kept buried at the back of her closet. She had bought them years ago when she thought she might interview for an administrative assistant job, but she'd never gathered the courage to apply. The fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't mopped floors or scrubbed bathrooms for a living. Still, she smoothed it out with her hands and stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, trying to see herself through a different lens. By the time she and Lily stepped out of the apartment, the city had started to come alive. Cars passed in slow streams, early commuters moved with tired eyes and coffee cups in hand. On the bus ride into downtown, Sarah stared out the window while Lily leaned against her shoulder. Neither spoke much, and Sarah was grateful for the silence. She needed every second of it to prepare herself for what might come. At 8:53, she stepped off the elevator onto the 37th floor of the Viaron Tower. The executive level felt even more sterile and sharp than usual. Polished marble floors, towering glass walls, the soft echo of heels on tile. It was the kind of place that whispered power and warned those who didn't belong. Sarah walked carefully, her bag clutched close to her side, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She passed a few assistants at their desks, some of whom gave her a polite glance, others who didn't seem to notice her at all. She wondered if they recognized her. If they knew she was the janitor. If they remembered her from the photograph. Or if she was already fading back into anonymity. When she reached Blake's office, she hesitated just a second before knocking. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. He stood behind his desk, dressed in another tailored suit, this time charcoal gray. His expression was serious, but not unkind. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sarah," he said, as if greeting a peer, not a subordinate. "Thanks for coming." She sat, smoothing her pants, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement she made. She had no idea how to sit in a CEO's office. No one had ever told her how to hold her hands, or where to rest her gaze, or what tone to use when speaking to someone who had the power to change her entire future with a single sentence. Blake sat across from her and leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "I meant what I said in the note," he began. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last week. Not just what you did in that meeting, but how it changed the room. You weren't just translating words. You were translating intention, tone, strategy. You knew exactly what needed to be said and how to say it. That's rare, and valuable." Sarah nodded slowly, unsure if he was building to something or simply offering praise. Blake continued, "I've been reviewing internal positions and I realized we've got a gap in our international communications team. We need someone who not only understands language, but who understands nuance, who's calm under pressure, and who can speak both professionally and humanely. I think that person is you." Sarah's mouth went dry, she opened it but no words came. Her instincts wanted to deflect, to say she wasn't qualified, that she hadn't done this kind of work in years, that she hadn't even been behind a desk since college. But then she thought of Lily's face in the kitchen the night before. Of the way the German executives had looked at her when she answered them directly, without shame or apology. And of the feeling in her chest when Blake had said, "Don't disappear." So she asked softly, "Are you offering me a job?" Yes, he said. Not a temporary assignment, a real position, full-time, with benefits, training. You'd be starting in a supporting role, of course, working under our director of communications, but I'd like to see where this could go, long-term. Sarah's eyes burned, and she had to blink a few times to keep the tears from falling. Why me? She whispered. You could find someone with more experience, someone with the right background, someone who doesn't have a gap on their resume the size of a canyon. Blake smiled then, just a little. Because someone with all that might have walked into that boardroom expecting to impress. You didn't expect anything. You just showed up. You stayed steady. You did the work. That matters more to me than a perfect resume. She sat there in stunned silence, her mind trying to catch up with her body. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a one-time fluke. Someone saw her. Not just as a crisis solution, not just as a good story, but as someone worth investing in. After a long pause, she said the only thing she could. I accept. Blake nodded, as if he had already known she would. He stood and extended his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, respectful. As she left the office, walking back down the polished hallway, the world felt a little different. Brighter. Not because everything had changed, but because something had. Something important. She didn't feel like the janitor walking through a place where she didn't belong. She felt like a woman reclaiming the space she had once believed was lost to her forever. A year later, the world looked different through Sarah's eyes. The change hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but slow and steady, like the shifting of seasons or the way daylight gradually lingers longer in spring. She had moved through each day with a kind of cautious determination, pushing herself beyond the life she had once believed was fixed. It hadn't been easy. There were days when self-doubt clung to her like a second skin, days when she still woke up before dawn out of habit, thinking she had to scrub floors, only to remember she now carried a different kind of responsibility. She still lived in the same apartment, but now she had a desk, an office, a title, a future. She had taken the position in the International Communications Department with a quiet, almost defiant humility. She didn't walk in with swagger or pretend to know everything. Instead, she listened, she learned. She stayed late when she had to and asked questions when she didn't know the answers. Her German, once buried and rusted from disuse, came alive with every email she translated, every video call she facilitated. It wasn't just language. She found herself guiding tone, rephrasing entire messages to bridge not just linguistic gaps but cultural ones. Soon her colleagues began to rely on her. They sent her drafts, asked for her input before presentations. People who had never looked her in the eye when she wore yellow gloves now came to her desk for advice. Blake stayed involved, though not intrusively. He would check in from time to time. Not just about work but about how she was adjusting. He never treated her like a charity case. He treated her like someone who had earned her place. Once, during a quarterly meeting, he introduced her to a board member as the sharpest mind on our international team. And though Sarah had flushed with embarrassment, something inside her had straightened with pride. Lily too was blossoming. She had received a scholarship to a private school not far from Sarah's new office. And every day, they rode the bus into the city together. Their routine had changed, but the closeness between them remained. Sarah made sure of that. No job, no matter how fulfilling, would ever come before her daughter. But now, for the first time, she didn't have to choose between stability and motherhood. She could be both. Present and ambitious. Loving and capable. A provider and a dreamer. There were still late nights, still bills to manage and exhaustion that curled around the edges of her days. But now it was a different kind of tired. It was the fatigue that came from building, not surviving. She started setting goals again. Small ones at first: enroll in a professional development course, polish her resume, practice public speaking. Then bigger ones: pitch a new regional communications strategy for the European division, apply for leadership training, mentor interns. She no longer felt like a ghost in someone else's building. She had carved a space for herself and it was growing. On the anniversary of the deal she had saved, Sarah found herself standing by the same boardroom where it had all begun. The glass wall was as clear and intimidating as ever, but she no longer felt invisible on the other side. A junior staff member was setting up for a new meeting, nervous and double-checking cables, and Sarah stopped to help him without thinking twice. He smiled in thanks, not realizing the significance of that room for her. She didn't tell him. She didn't need to. Back in her office, a small but sunlit space with a window overlooking a sliver of the skyline, Sarah found a bouquet of wildflowers on her desk. A handwritten card leaned gently against the vase. "Sometimes heroes wear yellow gloves. Thank you for reminding all of us what potential really looks like. BH." She smiled, not because of the compliment, but because of the memory. Not long ago, that moment had felt like the peak of her life, a miraculous anomaly in an otherwise difficult journey. But now, standing in her office, she understood it had been something else entirely. It had been the beginning. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and glanced at the framed photo beside it. Lily and her at the park, laughing, their faces illuminated by late afternoon sun. It was a reminder of why she kept moving forward, why she had chosen to risk being seen, why she had said yes that day when everything inside her screamed she wasn't ready. Because maybe no one ever feels ready when they're stepping back into who they were meant to be. And maybe, just maybe, impossible was never the truth. It was only the name of a story that hadn't finished yet. This story, at its core, isn't just about a janitor stepping in to save a corporate deal. It's about quiet brilliance, unseen resilience, and the courage it takes to reclaim your worth after the world has convinced you it's gone. What makes Sarah's journey so powerful isn't that she had the skills all along, but that she had the strength to use them when it mattered most, even when no one expected her to. The final chapter doesn't tie things up with a neat glittering bow. It leaves us with something better, a real sense of growth. Sarah doesn't become a CEO overnight. She doesn't move into a penthouse or ride off into a Hollywood sunset. But she rebuilds a life with dignity, purpose, and momentum. That's a rare kind of happy ending, the kind that feels earned. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest plot twists aren't dramatic rescues or grand gestures. Sometimes they're small moments of someone finally being seen, and even more powerful, choosing to see herself.